Invincible is my second favorite show of all time, and from what I've heard about Season 4 releasing in a few days, it might become my favorite. However, just because it's peak doesn't mean it lacks issues, and the most common complaint is the animation, but another one that I don't see talked about as much is the consistency. In some fights, Mark can topple cities, and in other fights, he can't even topple a bug. This makes you question whether or not the aforementioned bugs could outperform Mark when it comes to fighting a viltrumite like Conquest. That's why in today's video, I've compiled a list of things that Mark struggled against, and I'm going to decide whether or not Cecil should use them when the next viltrumite comes to Earth. Let's say this takes place in an alternate timeline, where Mark actually went out and fought in the Invincible War. While fighting, the actual Mark is triumphant, but he took a massive beating and slips into a coma, kind of like the Conquest fight. A week later, Mark is still out of commission and Conquest arrives, so Cecil must utilize everything at his disposal. We're going to go over what he could use based off of what hurt Mark, and I'll take my best guess to see if it'd have any effect on Conquest. There's two ways I see this going down. Conquest knows Mark's exact location, and that's how he was able to find him seemingly immediately, or Conquest only knows the general area Mark is going to be in. We're going to go over both options and what Cecil's plan should be, but first we need our weapons. Probably the most notorious scene in the entire show is when every single hero in America gets abducted by Doc Seismic. Mark gets embarrassed here, and at first I thought the answer was blatant. Conquest probably would have just done what Anissa did, but then I was rewatching the Season 4 trailer and noticed this shot. Now these bugs aren't the exact same, but we can assume they're pretty similar. These bugs have got Nolan down on the floor, so maybe they're actually strong, and I owe Mark an apology. Unfortunately, I still think Conquest would win the feud, whether it's because he just overpowers it with brute strength or launches it to space. There'd need to be an overwhelming amount of them. However, that's going to be pretty much impossible for Cecil since he probably can't even obtain one. Some of the repercussions of fighting is buildings being demolished, especially with a viltrumite in a city. Pretty much anything that is man-made Doc Seismic desires to destroy, so he'd probably end up assisting Conquest or just getting immediately deceased. Designed by the Maulers, this thing just ignores skin and goes straight for the nervous system, which was how it was able to paralyze Mark. However, Mark recovered significantly quicker than the rest, and therefore Conquest would probably do the same. Since the rest of the Guardians were also hit and took much longer than Mark to recover, we can assume that the stronger you are, the more hasty your recovery is. We see something similar when Mark hits Mohawk Mark's ears and it temporarily knocks him out, but for Conquest, it just stuns him for a couple seconds. Therefore, we can assume that the effect the nerve gun has on Conquest will follow a similar pattern. Maybe it'll stun him for like 5 or 10 seconds, but he'll quickly recover. Still, it can be useful, so we're going to add this to the list. Since he's already utilizing them, we won't spend as long covering them. These are going to be his heavy hitters and probably going to supply the most damage. However, after the events of Season 3, there's probably a very limited number left, and a lot of them are probably injured. During the Invincible War, the device broke and they were unable to craft more because the engineering wing was decimated. In this timeline, Cecil is much more prepared, and therefore, repairing the sound devices is top of his priority because it's the greatest weapon they have against the variants, and as far as he's aware, they can return any moment. This time, he'll make entire guns dedicated to blasting the sound, or it can just be an attachment to a gun, or maybe they can even do what they did in Stranger Things Season 5 and put it on a tank. Either way, Cecil has more noisemakers, which will be vital if Cecil actually conquers Conquest. However, like previously mentioned, Conquest is able to endure pain more than Mark, such as the ear clasp move, so it's not too much of a reach to assume he can resist, endure, and adapt to the pain of the noisemaker. Especially considering Mark was able to move his hands just enough to grab the earpiece and hurtle it onto the floor. He'd still be very hindered, so very weak and unable to fly, but he can still throw out decently strong punches. Angstrom's drones managed to hurt Mark and push him back, plus managed to push the variants. Considering no one else has used this tech, I'm going to assume it's inaccessible to Cecil due to it being in another dimension. However, Robot did have a line about it being of Earth origin, so I'm not too sure. My best guess is that it's materials he took from the main universe that he gave to the technicians to make stronger, which still involves multiverse stuff. Mark was able to crush the dragon's skull with a ton of effort, and Conquest could probably do that with minimal effort, or he could just launch the dragon into space. Also, I doubt Mr. Liu would want to help. In the Invincible War, they drew blood from the real Mark, but Mark wasn't fighting back. Conquest could easily decimate them, and Cecil knows that. Just like how he was reluctant to send Eve in, he wouldn't send these guys in either because he'd just be killing them. Even if Conquest is under immense agony due to the sound devices, he's still able to throw out punches as established earlier. Rex's splosions killed a variant, but he's now perished, so I don't really have to say much more. Powerplex hits you as hard as you hit him, so as long as Conquest doesn't realize that, somebody can just keep punching him in the back and he can just keep electrocuting Conquest until he's suffered too much. I also do think Scott would want to help as long as Invincible isn't involved. However, I don't think Cecil would let him join the fight because Conquest could probably split him in two with one punch. I don't know enough about Tech Jacket to include him, but the trailers confirmed he'll be a key component in the war, so if I did include him, then he'd probably play a major part and guarantee Conquest's demise. Now it's time for the actual fight. Going with option 1, Conquest would barge right into the Pentagon and find Mark before Cecil even has a chance to notice he's arrived. After noticing Mark is in a coma, Conquest would probably just grab him and take him to a viltrumite prison so he can fight him later, and without Eve or Oliver, I can confidently say Mark is not winning that fight. Therefore, Cecil is absolutely not winning if Conquest knows Mark's exact location, but if Conquest only knows the general area and where he can probably find him, things will play out very differently. He'd come down and start patrolling, but after not finding Mark, he'd start causing cataclysm to lure him out. As he's roaming around, this would give Cecil time to assemble his troops and everything he requires, such as tanks and soldiers. Then once the destruction initiates, he teleports in the soldier with the best accuracy. That soldier gets a vantage point and hits Conquest with the nerve gun while he's distracted, making it so he is unable to dodge. While stagnated, pretty much everything else like the soldiers and the tanks and the reanimen are deployed. I imagine Conquest would adapt to the pain like I said earlier, but he'd still be unable to fly. I feel like it'd be similar to how the rematch between Mark and Angstrom went. Conquest would be overwhelmed by the barrage of attacks at first, but eventually he'd be able to start breaking things. Due to the decreased number, he could probably kill all the reanimen after a while, but after that, he can't fly and walking is possible, but it'd be really sluggish. Therefore, he'd basically be trudging his way over to the soldiers, and all they have to do is take a couple steps back and Conquest won't be able to reach them. Conquest is basically just rendered useless because I doubt he'd even be strong enough to break the tanks. More heavy hitters like the Cape's crew might need to be sent in after a while, but eventually Eve would wake up and she could do something like fill his insides with acid or whatever. So yeah, I think it's possible for Cecil to defeat a viltrumite, but he'd need to be a lot more prepared than he is in the show. For example, if everything in the show played out the exact same except Mark was out of commission at the time of the Conquest fight, Cecil would have no noisemakers or nerve guns, anything, so he'd be cooked. Anyway, that's it for this video, so thanks for watching, bye bye.
Angstrom! You're dead!